Upon entering the maid's room, the millionaire was paralyzed when he saw a photo. The same photo of his beloved who disappeared 20 years ago. James stepped out of the sleek black SUV, his polished shoes crunching against the gravel driveway. The sprawling mansion stood before him, a stark contrast to the buzzing city life he had left behind. This property, tucked away in a secluded part of California, had once been his retreat. Now, it was just another asset, one of many that he barely visited anymore. But something had drawn him back this time, something more than just overseeing renovations. He couldn't explain it, but he had felt the pull. Maybe it was the quiet, the isolation, or the fact that here, away from the noise of his busy life, he could finally think about the one person who had haunted his dreams for the last 20 years, Isabella. As he walked through the front door, the cool breeze of air conditioning hit him, carrying with it the faint scent of freshly cut wood and paint. Workers were bustling about, setting up equipment, measuring walls, and hammering away at the tasks they'd been hired to complete. None of it interested James. His mind was elsewhere, drifting to the past, to a time when he had felt alive, full of hope, full of love. "Good afternoon, Mr. Thompson," said Robert, his longtime estate manager, snapping James out of his thoughts. "Afternoon," James replied absent-mindedly, barely glancing at the man before continuing further into the house. The house felt too large, too empty, despite the activity. Every corner seemed to echo with the ghosts of what could have been. It wasn't the same anymore. It hadn't been since Isabella disappeared. James had built an empire trying to distract himself from the gnawing ache that had settled in his chest ever since she vanished. His success in business had been meteoric, but his personal life, a wasteland. No amount of wealth could fill the void she had left behind. He moved through the house like a specter himself, wandering aimlessly until he found himself in one of the quieter wings. There, a woman caught his attention. She was standing in a modest uniform, cleaning the windows with careful precision. She didn't notice him at first, lost in her work. Her presence was unassuming, quiet. There was nothing flashy or overtly remarkable about her, yet something tugged at his curiosity. He had seen dozens of staff come and go over the years, most barely registering on his radar. But this woman was different. Something about the way she moved, the way she kept her head down, made James pause. He approached her slowly. "What's your name?" His voice cut through the silence. She jumped slightly, startled by his presence. Turning around, she clutched the cleaning rag nervously in her hand. "Emily," she said softly, her voice barely above a whisper. James nodded but didn't respond right away. There was something about her demeanor, almost like she was hiding. From what? He couldn't tell. He watched as she quickly excused herself and disappeared down the hallway, leaving James standing there alone. His mind wandered as he continued to explore the mansion. His thoughts drifted back to Emily, but more so, they drifted back to Isabella. Her face was a constant shadow in his memory, a smile forever out of reach. He shook his head, pushing the memories down, trying to focus on the present, but they wouldn't leave him. Later that evening, after the workers had left and the house had settled into a calm quiet, James found himself unable to sleep, restless. He wandered again, his feet taking him to places in the mansion he hadn't been in years. Eventually, he found himself standing outside one of the staff quarters, the room Emily had been cleaning earlier. Why had he come here? Even he didn't know. Something about her had unsettled him in a way he couldn't quite place. Was it her quiet demeanor? Her nervousness? Or was it something more? Driven by a strange compulsion, he pushed open the door. The room was simple. A neatly made bed, a small dresser, a few personal items scattered here and there. But something caught his eye immediately. Hanging on the wall, in a delicate frame, was a photo. James froze. It couldn't be. His heart pounded in his chest as he stepped closer, his breath catching in his throat. The woman in the photo, He would recognize that face anywhere. Isabella. His Isabella. The photo was old, weathered, but unmistakable. Her soft features, her gentle smile. It was her. But why was it here? Why did this woman, this cleaning lady, have a picture of the love of his life? The woman he had spent the last 2 decades searching for. 1,000 questions swirled in his mind, but none of them had answers. Not yet. His hand trembled as he reached out, brushing the edge of the frame, his thoughts spiraling. What did this mean? How could it be? Suddenly, the sound of footsteps broke the silence, and James turned sharply. It was Emily, standing in the doorway, her eyes wide with a mix of confusion and fear. "Where did you get this?" His voice was rough, demanding, his emotions barely in check. Emily looked between him and the photo, her face pale. She took a hesitant step forward, her voice trembling. That's my mother." James stood frozen, his breath caught in his throat, as Emily's words echoed in the room. "That's my mother." A strange numbness crept through his body. His mind reeled, struggling to reconcile what he had just heard. The photo in front of him, the face that had haunted his dreams for 2 decades, Isabella. And now, this young woman, standing in front of him, was saying she was her daughter. James felt like the floor had just been pulled out from beneath him. His eyes darted from the picture to Emily, as if trying to find some explanation in her face, some clue that would help him make sense of this impossible connection. How? His voice cracked. How is that possible? Emily, standing in the doorway, shifted nervously, her eyes wide and uncertain. She looked at the photo on the wall, then back at James, clearly not understanding the depth of his reaction. To her, it was just a picture of a woman she barely knew. To him, it was the center of his world, the reason for every breath he had taken for the last 20 years. I don't know, Emily stammered, her voice shaking. I never really knew her. I was very young when she disappeared. James swallowed hard, his heart racing. He had spent the last 2 decades searching for Isabella, thinking he would never find her. And now, her daughter stood before him, unaware of the weight her words carried. You said she disappeared, James finally managed, trying to keep his voice steady, though his emotions were anything but. What happened to her? Emily glanced down at her feet, her fingers nervously fidgeting with the hem of her shirt. She left when I was just a baby. I don't remember much. I grew up in foster care. Found this picture only recently. James took a slow breath, trying to keep the whirlwind of emotions from consuming him. Isabella had a daughter. His Isabella. It was too much to process. But the more he stared at Emily, the more pieces of the puzzle began to fall into place. There was something familiar about her. Something in her eyes that reminded him of the woman he had loved and lost. He clenched his fists at his sides, the intensity of the moment almost too much to bear. He had to know more. He needed answers. How did you find this photo? He asked, his voice softer now, though his heart was still pounding in his chest. Emily hesitated, glancing between James and the framed picture, as if weighing how much to reveal. It was tucked away in some old things. My foster family kept it for me. I didn't even know I had it until I was older. I don't have much else about her, just this. James felt a wave of emotion crash over him. Isabella had a daughter, and no one had ever told him. Not once, in all his searching, had anyone mentioned a child. But why? Why had she kept this secret? And more importantly, where had she gone? What had happened to her? I need to know more about her, James said, his voice barely above a whisper. I need to know what happened to her. Emily's brow furrowed in confusion. I'm not sure how much I can help. I was put into the foster system when I was a baby. My mother, she never came back. No one ever told me where she went or what happened to her. James felt his heart break all over again. Isabella had disappeared from both of their lives, leaving behind only questions. But for James, this was more than just a mystery. It was personal. He had loved Isabella, had spent years mourning her, and now, standing in front of him, was the one remaining connection to her, Emily. "Do you know anything at all?" James pressed, trying not to sound too desperate, though every fiber of his being was on edge. "Any details? Anything at all about where she might have gone or why she left?" Emily shook her head slowly. "No, nothing. I don't remember her. The foster system didn't keep much information about her, and no one ever talked about what happened. It's like she just vanished." Vanished. The word hung in the air like a dark cloud. That's exactly what had happened to Isabella. She had vanished without a trace, leaving no clues behind, only heartbreak. James stepped back, rubbing his temples as he tried to process everything. This couldn't be a coincidence. The odds of him stumbling across Isabella's daughter, their daughter, were too slim. Fate, perhaps, had brought him here to this moment. But now that he had found this link to Isabella, what was he supposed to do? James looked at Emily again, her nervousness palpable. She wasn't just a stranger anymore. She was a part of Isabella, a part of the life he had lost. "I'm sorry," Emily said quietly, her voice trembling with uncertainty. "I don't know why you're so upset. I didn't mean to cause any trouble." James shook his head quickly, taking a deep breath to steady himself. "You didn't do anything wrong," he said, his voice softer now. "It's just, I knew her. I knew your mother." Emily's eyes widened in shock. You did?" James nodded, his heart heavy. "I loved her. I loved her more than anything in this world." The room fell silent as Emily absorbed the weight of his words. James felt like the past was crashing down on him, an avalanche of emotions he hadn't been prepared for. But now, there was something more, something he hadn't anticipated. Emily was here, the last connection to Isabella, and she was as lost as he was. "I need to find out what happened," James said, his voice filled with a quiet determination. "For both of us, I need to know why she left and why she never came back." Emily stared at him, her eyes reflecting a mixture of confusion, fear, and maybe even hope. She had lived her whole life without answers. And now, standing before her, was a man who seemed just as desperate to understand. For the first time in years, James felt something stir within him, a purpose beyond his wealth and success. He had spent so long searching for closure, and now it seemed like he might finally be on the path to finding it. But the truth, he realized, might be far more complicated than he ever imagined. The room felt heavy with unspoken words as James processed what Emily had just told him. The connection between them was undeniable, yet it raised more questions than answers. James couldn't shake the feeling that fate had brought them together for a reason, but he still didn't fully understand what that reason was. He needed to know more about Emily, about Isabella, and about the years that had been lost. James sat down on the edge of the small bed in Emily's room, the photo of Isabella still hanging on the wall, staring back at him like a haunting reminder of everything he had lost. Emily stood awkwardly near the door, unsure of what to say or do next. The silence stretched between them, thick and uncomfortable. "Tell me everything you know," James said finally, breaking the tension. His voice was low, but there was an urgency to it. He needed to know every detail, no matter how small. Emily hesitated, her fingers playing nervously with the hem of her shirt again. She didn't seem to know where to begin. I don't know much," she said softly, her eyes flicking up to meet his before quickly looking away again. "I was too young when she left. All I have are stories from the foster families, but they never really knew her." James leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees, trying to keep his frustration in check. It wasn't Emily's fault that she didn't have answers. but the lack of information only made the hole inside him feel deeper. "What do you remember?" James asked, trying to keep his voice calm. Even the smallest details could help. Emily swallowed hard, clearly uncomfortable with being the center of his focus. I don't have real memories of her," she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. "I mean, I remember bits and pieces, like her laugh, or the way she used to sing to me before bed. But it's all fuzzy. It's like trying to remember a dream." James nodded slowly, his heart aching with each word. He had imagined so many different versions of Isabella's life after she disappeared. But this fragmented reality was harder to accept than anything else. "She never came back," Emily continued, her voice tinged with sadness. "I used to hope, when I was younger, that she would show up one day and explain everything. But she never did." James could feel the weight of her words, the loneliness that had shadowed Emily's life. He had known a different kind of loneliness, the kind that came from loving someone so deeply and losing them. But Emily's loneliness was different. She had grown up with questions instead of memories, and that was a pain James couldn't fully comprehend. "Do you have anything else of hers?" James asked, trying to cling to the hope that there might be more clues, more answers hidden somewhere. Emily shook her head slowly. "Just that photo," she said, glancing at the framed picture. "It's the only thing I have that belonged to her. I found it when I turned 18, in a box of things my last foster family had kept for me. They didn't know much about her either, just that she left me at a hospital when I was a baby." James felt a lump form in his throat. The image of Isabella leaving her daughter behind, likely out of desperation, or maybe to protect her, was almost too much to bear. He had always believed that if Isabella had disappeared, it had been against her will. And now, hearing that she had left Emily at a hospital, his suspicions seemed to be confirmed. Isabella had been running from something or someone, and she hadn't had a choice. But why? Why had she disappeared? And what had forced her to abandon her own child? James stood up abruptly, pacing the small room as his mind raced with possibilities. "She was running from something," he muttered, more to himself than to Emily. "She wouldn't have just left you. She wouldn't have left me." Emily watched him, her expression conflicted. "I don't know," she said quietly. "I've thought about it a lot. I used to think maybe she didn't want me, but that doesn't feel right either. The way she looked in that photo, she seemed so happy." James turned to face her, his eyes intense. "She loved you," he said firmly. "I'm sure of that. She must have left you because she thought it was the only way to keep you safe." Emily blinked, clearly taken aback by the certainty in his voice. "How can you be so sure?" James hesitated for a moment before answering. "Because I knew her," he said softly. "I knew how much she wanted a family. She wouldn't have walked away from that unless she was forced to." Emily stared at him for a long moment, as if trying to process the gravity of what he was saying. "If she was forced to leave," Emily began, "then who or what was she running from?" James didn't have an answer, not yet. But he knew that this was only the beginning. The more he learned about Emily's past, the clearer it became that Isabella's disappearance had been far more complicated than he had ever imagined. And if she had been running from someone, that meant there were still dangerous people out there, people who might have answers. "I don't know yet," James admitted, his voice dark with determination. "But I'm going to find out." Emily's eyes widened in surprise. "What do you mean?" "I have resources," James said, his mind already working through the possibilities. "I can dig into the past, find out what really happened. You deserve to know the truth, and so do I." Emily looked uncertain, her brow furrowing as she tried to make sense of his sudden resolve. "But why? Why do you care so much?" James met her gaze, his expression softening for the first time since they had started talking. "Because I loved your mother," he said quietly, and I owe it to both of you to find out what happened." For a moment, neither of them spoke. The air between them was thick with emotion, with unspoken questions and unresolved pain. But beneath it all, there was a flicker of hope. Hope that the truth, no matter how painful, might finally come to light. Emily took a deep breath, as if steeling herself for what was to come. "Okay," she said finally, her voice steady. "If you're going to find out the truth, then I want to help." James nodded, a sense of purpose settling over him. For the first time in years, he felt like he was finally moving toward something real, something that mattered. The answers had been hidden for too long, but now they were within reach. The decision to investigate had sparked something inside James, a flame that had long been dormant. It wasn't just about finding the truth for himself anymore. Emily deserved answers too. She had lived her whole life with the same emptiness he felt, and together, they might finally uncover what had happened to Isabella. But James knew it wouldn't be easy. The trail was cold, and 2 decades had passed since she disappeared. The next morning, James wasted no time. He contacted an old friend, a private investigator named Michael who had helped him in the early days of searching for Isabella. Though those initial efforts had led nowhere, James believed that with Emily now in the picture, they could unearth new leads. There was more at stake now, and he was determined to follow every thread, no matter how thin. He paced the study in his mansion, the phone pressed to his ear. Michael's voice on the other end was gruff, as it always was. "You're serious about this, James? After all these years?" "Dead serious," James replied, his tone firm. "I've found something I never expected. Isabella. She had a daughter. And I think whatever happened to her might be tied to something bigger." There was a pause on the other end of the line, and James could practically hear the gears turning in Michael's mind. A daughter? Michael's voice was tinged with surprise. "That changes things. You think her disappearance was planned?" "I don't just think it, Michael. I know it now. I've already pieced together some of the story. She was running from something, or someone, and that's why she left Emily behind." Another pause, this one longer. Michael had always been a skeptic, but he also knew when to trust James's instincts. "All right," he said finally. "I'll start digging again. I'll pull the old files and see if there's anything we missed. If she was running, maybe there are clues in her past we overlooked. I'll also look into the foster records, see if there's anything unusual there." James exhaled, relieved to have someone on his side. "Thanks, Michael. I need to know the truth for Emily's sake. Let me know as soon as you find anything." After hanging up, James leaned back in his chair, staring at the ceiling. The truth had eluded him for so long, and now, for the first time in years, he felt like he was finally moving toward it. But with every step forward came a growing sense of dread. What if the answers they uncovered were more painful than the questions? A soft knock on the door pulled him from his thoughts. Emily stood in the doorway, her face a mixture of curiosity and concern. She had been quiet since their conversation the night before, clearly processing everything James had told her. "Did you find anything out yet?" she asked, stepping into the room. "Not yet," James replied, gesturing for her to sit down. "But I've got someone looking into it. An old friend of mine, a private investigator. He's good at what he does." Emily nodded slowly, taking a seat across from him. "It's strange," she said after a moment. "I've spent my whole life wondering about her. And now, all of a sudden, it feels like I might finally get some answers. But I don't know if I'm ready." James understood that feeling all too well. "It's okay to be scared," he said softly. "I've spent years chasing ghosts. Sometimes not knowing seems easier than facing the truth. But whatever we find, we'll face it together." Emily offered a small, grateful smile. "I guess I'm just worried that... What if we don't find anything? What if it's all just a dead end?" James leaned forward, his voice gentle but resolute. "We'll find something, Emily. I promise you that. Your mother didn't just disappear for no reason. There's more to this story, and we're going to uncover it." They spent the rest of the day going over what little information they had. Emily's memories were too fragmented to provide much detail, but she did remember small things, like the hospital where she had been left and a few scattered recollections from her foster families. James took note of everything, determined to leave no stone unturned. A few days later, James received a call from Michael. "I found something," he said, his voice low, as if what he had uncovered was too dangerous to speak of freely. James's pulse quickened. "What is it?" "There's a name that kept coming up when I went through the old records. It's someone connected to Isabella's past. A man named Victor." James frowned, trying to recall if he had ever heard the name before, but it didn't ring any bells. "Who is he?" "That's what I'm still trying to figure out," Michael replied. "But from what I've gathered so far, he's bad news, dangerous. I think he might be the key to everything." James's mind raced. Isabella had never mentioned anyone named Victor, at least not that he could remember. But if this man had been involved in her life and her disappearance, then finding him was the next crucial step. "What do we know about him?" James asked, gripping the edge of his desk. "Not much yet, but I'm working on it," Michael said. "He seems to have connections to some unsavory people. If Isabella was running from him, it makes sense why she'd go to such lengths to disappear. She was trying to protect herself and her daughter." James's heart clenched at the thought of Isabella being in danger all those years ago, of her being forced to make the impossible choice of leaving her daughter behind to keep her safe. It was a choice he couldn't imagine making, but now he understood. She hadn't abandoned Emily. She had been trying to save her. "Keep digging," James said, his voice tight with determination. "I need to know everything about this Victor, whatever it takes." After hanging up the phone, James sat in silence for a long time, the weight of the revelation sinking in. There were people, dangerous people, connected to Isabella's disappearance, and it was becoming clear that she had been running for her life. Now, the question wasn't just what had happened to her. It was how far these people had gone to keep their secrets hidden. Emily appeared in the doorway again, sensing the change in his mood. "What did you find out?" James looked up at her, his expression grim. "There's a man, Victor. He might be the one your mother was running from." Emily's eyes widened in shock. "Victor? I've never heard that name before." "Neither have I," James admitted. "But he's connected to everything. We just have to figure out how." Emily nodded, though the fear in her eyes was unmistakable. They were getting closer to the truth, but with each step forward, the danger seemed to grow. For the first time, James realized just how high the stakes were. Whatever secrets had been buried with Isabella's disappearance, they were about to come crashing into the present. The days passed in a blur of tension and anticipation. James could feel the pieces of the puzzle starting to come together, but the more they uncovered, the more dangerous things seemed to get. The name Victor weighed heavily on his mind. Who was this man? And what did he have to do with Isabella's disappearance? James had hoped that Michael would have more information soon, but the silence from his investigator was unsettling. It was unlike Michael to take so long without reporting back, and that only heightened James's anxiety. He wasn't sure if he was prepared for what they might find, but there was no turning back now. The truth had become a dark, unavoidable force, pulling him deeper with each passing day. Emily had been quiet, too. She spent most of her time at the mansion, reading through whatever documents and information James had gathered over the years about Isabella's disappearance. But as much as they pieced together, there were still so many gaps in the story, so many questions left unanswered. Late one evening, the phone rang. James grabbed it immediately, hoping it was Michael with news. It was... "I've got something," Michael said, his voice low and serious. James's heart pounded in his chest. "What is it?" I managed to trace Victor's movements back to a few key events in Isabella's life, Michael began, his tone grim. Turns out he's been involved in some shady business for years. Organized crime, smuggling, you name it. He wasn't just some random man in Isabella's past. He was dangerous. James gripped the phone tighter. How does this connect to her disappearance? Michael hesitated before continuing. Victor had connections to some people she was associated with before she met you. From what I can gather, Isabella may have gotten involved with him by accident. She was trying to escape a life she didn't want any part of. And when she crossed paths with you, it seems like she thought she had a chance to start fresh. But Victor, he didn't let go easily. He was obsessed with control, and when she tried to leave, he must have gone after her. James felt a wave of nausea wash over him. Isabella had never told him about this part of her life. She had always been so careful, so private. Now it made sense why. She had been hiding from something far worse than James had ever imagined. He must have found her, James said, his voice tight with emotion. That's why she disappeared. Michael's silence confirmed his suspicions. I found a few leads on Victor's whereabouts, Michael continued. He's still alive, and he's still in the shadows, keeping a low profile. But he's out there, James, and I don't think he's forgotten what happened. James closed his eyes, the weight of the revelation crashing down on him. All these years, he had been searching for Isabella, thinking she had simply vanished without a trace. But the truth was far more sinister. She had been running for her life, trying to protect herself and Emily from a man who would stop at nothing to control her. We need to find him, James said firmly, the anger rising in his chest. He's the key to everything. I've already started tracking him down, Michael replied. But be careful, James. If Victor's involved, this could get dangerous. He's not the kind of man who leaves loose ends. James nodded, though Michael couldn't see it. I don't care about the danger. I need to know what happened to Isabella. And I need to protect Emily. After hanging up, James sat in the quiet of his study, his mind racing with the implications of what Michael had found. He couldn't help but feel a deep sense of guilt. Isabella had been in danger all along, and he had never known. If he had known, could he have saved her? Could he have protected her from this monster, Victor? But there was no time to dwell on the past. Now, he had to focus on what was coming next. He had to find Victor and finally put an end to the nightmare that had haunted him for 2 decades. The next morning, James told Emily everything. He could see the fear in her eyes as he explained who Victor was and the role he likely played in her mother's disappearance. So, my mother was running from him? Emily asked, her voice barely a whisper. James nodded. That's what it looks like. She didn't just vanish. She was trying to protect you and herself from him. Emily's face paled. But why? Why would he be after her? James hesitated, not wanting to overwhelm her with the full extent of what he had learned. Victor is dangerous. He had control over her life in ways that I didn't know about. And when she tried to escape, he must have come after her. She left you behind to keep you safe. Emily looked away, her brow furrowed in thought. All this time, I thought she had just left me, but she was protecting me. James could see the emotional weight settling on her. It was the same feeling he had carried for years, the crushing burden of loss, but now mixed with the understanding that Isabella had made an impossible choice to save her child. I'm going to find him, James said, his voice filled with quiet determination. And when I do, we'll get the answers we need. Emily looked back at him, her eyes wide with fear. What if he's still dangerous? What if something happens to you? James reached out and placed a reassuring hand on her shoulder. I've dealt with dangerous people before. I'm not going into this without a plan. But I need you to trust me. We have to know the truth. Emily nodded, though the fear in her eyes remained. Okay, she said quietly. But I want to help. I can't just sit back and wait. She was my mother. James understood her desire to be involved. Emily had been through so much already, and this was her battle too. We'll do this together, he promised. But we have to be smart. Victor's not someone we can just confront head on. The days that followed were filled with tense anticipation as Michael continued his investigation. James and Emily worked together to piece together the information they had, each day feeling like they were one step closer to the truth, but also one step closer to danger. Then, one evening, the phone rang again. It was Michael, and his voice was more urgent than ever. "I've got a location," he said, his voice tense. "Victor's been hiding out in a small town upstate. I don't know how long he'll be there, but this is our best shot." James's heart raced. It was finally happening. The answers they had been searching for were within reach. "Send me the details," James said, his voice filled with resolve. As he hung up the phone, James turned to Emily. "It's time. We're going to find him." Emily's eyes were wide with a mixture of fear and determination. "And then what?" James didn't hesitate. "Then, we'll make sure he pays for what he did to your mother." The tension in the air was palpable. After weeks of searching, planning, and anticipating, James and Emily were on the brink of finally confronting the man who had caused so much pain. Victor. The drive to the small, secluded town upstate felt longer than it was, each passing mile only amplifying the anxiety sitting like a weight in James's chest. Emily sat beside him, silent but clearly deep in thought. She had insisted on coming along, despite James's initial hesitation. This was personal for her, and he understood that. After all, it was her mother they were seeking justice for. James had already lost so much. He couldn't bear the thought of Emily getting hurt too. But she was resolute, and in the end, he didn't have the heart to stop her. As they drove, James's mind wandered to the life Isabella must have lived in fear. The idea of her being hunted by a man like Victor, someone powerful, someone dangerous, sent a wave of anger surging through him. How had he missed this? How had he been so blind to the fact that Isabella had been in so much danger? But that didn't matter now. What mattered was getting the answers he and Emily deserved. The small town came into view just as the sun began to dip below the horizon, casting long shadows over the dusty streets. It was the kind of place where everyone knew everyone, where secrets didn't stay hidden for long. James parked the car a block away from the address Michael had given him, the engine's low hum fading into silence as they both sat there for a moment, collecting their thoughts. "This is it," James said quietly, glancing over at Emily. "Are you sure you're ready?" Emily swallowed hard but nodded, her jaw set in determination. "I have to be. We need to know the truth." James admired her strength. Despite everything she had been through, she was still standing, still fighting. And now they were going to face the man responsible for tearing their lives apart. They got out of the car and walked slowly toward the small, nondescript building where Victor was supposedly hiding. It didn't look like much, a run-down house with peeling paint and a sagging roof. But looks could be deceiving. James knew better than to assume that a man like Victor would let his guard down, even in a place like this. As they approached the door, James could feel his heart pounding in his chest. He had been in dangerous situations before, had faced men with power and influence. But this felt different. This wasn't just about business or money. This was personal. He raised his hand and knocked firmly on the door, the sound echoing in the stillness of the evening. For a long moment, nothing happened. Then slowly, the door creaked open. A man stood in the doorway. He was older than James had expected, his once strong frame softened by time. But there was no mistaking the sharpness in his eyes. This was Victor. For a moment, no one spoke. James could feel the tension between them, the air thick with unspoken accusations and unresolved history. Emily stood slightly behind him, her breath shallow and quick. Victor's eyes flicked from James to Emily, and something in his expression shifted. Recognition, maybe, or understanding. "So, he said finally, his voice rough and worn. "You've come to find me after all these years." James clenched his fists at his sides, trying to keep his anger in check. "We're here for answers," he said, his voice steady despite the fire burning inside him. "You know why?" Victor's gaze lingered on Emily, his lips curling into a faint, twisted smile. "Ah, the daughter," he murmured. "You've grown up, haven't you? I suppose you've been wondering what happened to dear old Mom." Emily's face flushed with anger, but she didn't speak. James could feel the weight of her emotions radiating from her, but he knew she was holding it together, just as he had asked her to. "I don't care about your games," James snapped, taking a step forward. "I want the truth. What happened to Isabella? Why did she disappear? And why did you make her run?" Victor leaned against the doorframe, his expression infuriatingly calm. "Isabella. She was a complicated woman. Too complicated for her own good, I suppose. She got involved in things she didn't fully understand, and when she tried to run from it, well, things didn't go the way she planned." James could feel the rage boiling beneath the surface. "What did you do to her?" Victor raised an eyebrow, clearly enjoying the effect his cryptic answers were having. "I didn't do anything to her," he said, his tone casual, almost indifferent. "She made her choices, and those choices led her to me. She thought she could escape, but the world doesn't work that way." James took another step closer, his voice low and dangerous. "You hunted her. You made her leave her daughter behind. You destroyed her life." Victor's smile faded, replaced by a cold, hard look. "She destroyed her own life the moment she decided to cross me," he said sharply. "I gave her everything, and she threw it all away because of some ridiculous notion of freedom." The words hit James like a punch to the gut. He had known there was more to Isabella's past than she had told him, but hearing it laid out like this, so callously, made his stomach turn. "She wasn't yours to control," James said through gritted teeth. Victor chuckled, the sound bitter and hollow. "That's where you're wrong, James. Everything in her life was mine to control, and when she tried to take it away, I made sure she paid for it." James could feel Emily trembling beside him, and he placed a steadying hand on her arm. She had heard enough. "Where is she?" James demanded, his voice raw with emotion. "What did you do to her?" Victor's eyes narrowed, and for a moment, James thought he saw a flicker of something. Fear, perhaps, or maybe regret. "She's gone," he said finally, his voice quieter now. "She tried to run, but she couldn't get far enough. Not from me." The words hit James like a blow, confirming what he had feared all along. Isabella was gone. She had spent her last days running from this man, this monster who had taken everything from her. Emily let out a choked sob, the reality of it crashing down on her all at once. James turned to her, pulling her close, feeling her body shake with the weight of her grief. Victor watched them in silence, his expression unreadable. "You wanted answers," he said quietly. "Now you have them." James stared at him, his mind racing. There was still more he needed to know, more he needed to understand. But for now, all he could feel was the hollow emptiness of knowing Isabella was truly gone. "We'll leave," James said finally, his voice cold and distant. "But this isn't over." Victor didn't reply, simply watching as James and Emily turned and walked away, their steps heavy with the weight of everything they had just learned. As they drove away from the town, the silence between them was thick with sorrow. Emily stared out the window, her eyes red but dry, while James gripped the steering wheel, his knuckles white. They had found their answers, but at what cost? And now, with Victor still out there, James knew one thing for certain. There would be no peace until justice was done. The drive back to the mansion was long, silent, and heavy with the weight of the revelations. The truth, as bitter and painful as it was, had finally surfaced. Isabella had been running for her life, and Victor had ensured she never made it far. Now, James and Emily had the answers they sought, but the price was knowing that Isabella had never found peace. James couldn't stop thinking about Victor's smug expression, the way he had delivered the truth without an ounce of remorse. The fury that had simmered inside James for years now boiled over. He gripped the steering wheel tightly, his knuckles turning white. But there was more than anger burning inside him. There was guilt. How had he never known about Victor? How had he never realized that Isabella had been living in fear, right under his nose? Beside him, Emily sat motionless, her face turned toward the window. She hadn't spoken since they left the small town, her emotions seemingly locked behind a wall she had built to keep from breaking. James wanted to reach out, to say something, anything, that might help. But what could he say? Nothing could bring Isabella back. When they finally arrived back at the mansion, the sun had long since set, and the darkness outside mirrored the emptiness inside James. He parked the car, and they both got out, neither of them making a move to speak. It wasn't until they reached the door that Emily finally broke the silence. "What do we do now?" Her voice was quiet, strained, as if the weight of everything had finally settled on her shoulders. James took a deep breath, trying to form the words. "We make sure he pays for what he did," he said, his tone resolute. "Victor won't get away with this." Emily nodded slowly, but there was doubt in her eyes. "And how do we do that? He's dangerous, James. He has power, connections. I don't want to lose you, too." Her voice cracked on the last words, and James felt a pang of guilt. She had already lost so much: her mother, her sense of security, her innocence. He couldn't put her through any more pain. But he also knew he couldn't just walk away from this. Not now. "I'll be careful," he promised, though even he knew how thin that promise was. "But Victor can't keep doing this. He needs to be stopped." Emily looked at him for a long moment, her eyes searching his face. Finally, she sighed, defeated. "Just promise me you'll be careful." James nodded, pulling her into a brief hug. She was strong, stronger than he had realized. But this wasn't her battle to fight. He had failed Isabella, but he wouldn't fail Emily. As they entered the mansion, James's mind churned with thoughts of what needed to be done. Victor's power and connections were real, but James had resources of his own. He wasn't just going to sit back and let the man who had destroyed his life get away with it. The next morning, James contacted Michael. His friend had always been reliable, but as the phone rang, an uneasy feeling settled in the pit of James's stomach. Something didn't feel right. "James," Michael answered after the second ring, his voice low and cautious. "We need to talk." James's heart skipped a beat. "What's going on?" There was a pause on the other end, and James could hear the tension in Michael's voice when he spoke again. "It's Victor. He knows we've been looking into him, and, well, I think he's making moves to protect himself." James's pulse quickened. "What do you mean?" "Let's just say, people who've tried to dig too deep into Victor's business don't end up in great shape," Michael said, his voice grim. "I've been careful, but the deeper I go, the more dangerous it gets. He has eyes everywhere." James clenched his jaw, anger flaring inside him. Victor wasn't just a threat. He was an enemy with far-reaching influence, someone who wouldn't hesitate to eliminate anyone who got too close to the truth. "Then we'll have to be smarter," James said, trying to keep his voice steady. "I'm not backing down." Michael sighed. "I didn't think you would. But you need to know something else. Victor's been pulling strings in your life for a long time, James. I went back through some old records and I found evidence that ties him to your business dealings. Indirectly, of course, but enough to show he's been manipulating things for years." James froze, his mind spinning. "What are you saying?" "I'm saying that while you were building your empire, Victor was benefiting. He's been working in the shadows, controlling key players in your company, siphoning off resources, all while keeping you distracted with the search for Isabella." The words hit James like a punch to the gut. He had always prided himself on being in control, on knowing every aspect of his business. But the thought that Victor had been there, pulling strings behind the scenes, manipulating him, it was almost too much to comprehend. "He's been playing me," James whispered, more to himself than to Michael. "Yes," Michael confirmed. "And he's still doing it. He's made a fortune off your success, all while keeping you in the dark. This goes deeper than just Isabella, James. He's been using you." James's grip on the phone tightened, fury coursing through him. Victor hadn't just taken Isabella from him. He had stolen years of his life, controlling his destiny from the shadows. "What do we do?" James asked, his voice cold and determined. "There's more," Michael said, his tone serious. "I think someone close to you has been helping him. A mole. Someone feeding him information from the inside." James's stomach turned. Betrayed. Someone he trusted had been working with Victor all along, undermining him, betraying him. Who? "I'm not sure yet, but I'm close. Just be careful who you trust. Victor has people everywhere." James hung up the phone, his mind racing. A mole. Someone inside his circle had been working against him this entire time. The realization made his blood run cold. He had trusted people with his life, with his business, and now he had no idea who might be loyal to Victor. As he paced the room, trying to piece together everything Michael had told him, Emily appeared in the doorway, concern etched across her face. "What's wrong?" James hesitated, not wanting to burden her with more than she was already dealing with. But he couldn't keep this from her. "Victor's been manipulating my business for years, and someone close to me has been helping him." Emily's eyes widened in shock. "What? Who?" "I don't know yet," James said, frustration creeping into his voice. "But I'm going to find out. Victor has been playing me for too long, and I'm not letting him get away with it." Emily stood silent for a moment, processing the enormity of what James had just told her. Then, with a resolve that surprised even James, she stepped forward. "We'll figure this out together," she said, her voice steady. "No matter what it takes." James nodded, feeling a surge of determination. They had come too far to stop now. Victor had stolen enough from them, and it was time to take back control. But as they prepared to unravel the web of lies and deceit that had been spun around them, James knew one thing for certain. The road ahead was about to get even more dangerous. The betrayal cut deeper than James could have anticipated. Victor's manipulation had spanned not just years but decades, affecting both his personal and professional life. The discovery that someone within his own circle, a trusted confidant, had been feeding Victor information left him both enraged and cautious. Now, more than ever, every move had to be calculated, every step precise. Sitting in his office, James stared at the documents scattered across his desk. Files on Victor Mine, old business reports, names of people he had once trusted but now doubted. His phone buzzed on the desk, pulling him from his thoughts. It was Michael again, and James answered quickly. "I've done some more digging," Michael said, his voice grave. "It looks like Victor's influence reaches further than we thought. He's been working with someone inside your business for years, funneling resources, manipulating deals behind the scenes. Whoever it is. They've been playing a long game." James clenched his fist. "Do you know who?" "I'm close," Michael replied. "I've narrowed it down to a few names, but I need more time to confirm." Time. It was the one thing James felt was slipping through his fingers. Every minute that passed was a minute Victor continued to operate in the shadows. "I can't wait much longer, Michael. Whoever this person is, they're too close. I need to know now." "I get it," Michael said. "But rushing this could blow the whole thing. Let me finish what I started. We'll get him." James exhaled sharply. "All right. Keep me posted. And be careful. Victor's dangerous. Always am," Michael said before the line went dead. James leaned back in his chair, the weight of everything pressing down on him. The betrayal felt like a noose tightening around his neck. He had built his empire brick by brick, and to think that someone had been undermining him all this time was almost too much to bear. He glanced out the window, watching the sunset paint the sky in deep oranges and reds. He wasn't just fighting for justice anymore. He was fighting to take back control of his life. Emily had been quiet since the revelations about Victor's manipulation. She spent most of her time in the library, poring over old records, determined to help James piece together the puzzle. He admired her strength, but he could see the toll it was taking on her. The weight of learning about her mother's fate, coupled with the danger they now faced, had drained the light from her eyes. That evening, James found her sitting by the fireplace, a stack of old business files beside her. Her expression was one of intense focus, but there was an undercurrent of sadness that she couldn't quite hide. "Emily," he said gently, sitting down across from her. "You've been at this for hours. You need to take a break." She looked up at him, her eyes tired but determined. "I can't stop now, James. I need to understand what happened. I need to help." James admired her determination, but he could see how much this was wearing on her. "We'll get there," he reassured her. "But you can't burn yourself out. We need to be sharp, especially now that we know someone close to us has been working with Victor." Emily nodded slowly, but the tension in her shoulders didn't ease. I don't know who to trust anymore," she admitted. "I thought I understood what my life was, but now everything feels like a lie." James reached across the table, placing a comforting hand on hers. "I know how you feel," he said softly. "But we're going to figure this out. Together." For a moment, they sat in silence, the crackling of the fire filling the room. James could feel the weight of everything pressing down on them: Isabella's death, Victor's betrayal, the mystery of the mole. But for the first time in a long while, he didn't feel alone in carrying that burden. The next morning, James received an unexpected call from one of his senior advisors, a man named Charles who had been with the company for nearly as long as James had. Charles had always been loyal, at least as far as James could tell, but with everything that had come to light, James wasn't sure who to trust anymore. "James, we need to talk," Charles said, his voice tense. James's gut twisted. "About what?" "There's been some movement in the company's finances. I think someone's trying to siphon money out of one of the accounts." James's pulse quickened. "How long has this been going on?" "I just noticed it last night," Charles replied. "But the pattern seemed to go back further. I don't know who's behind it, but it's deliberate." James leaned forward, the fire of anger building in his chest again. "I want a full report, every suspicious transaction, every inconsistency. Bring me everything." Charles hesitated for a moment. "Are you sure you want to handle this internally? It might be safer to involve outside auditors." "No," James said firmly. "We handle this in-house. The fewer people who know, the better." Charles agreed, and they ended the call. But James couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. He trusted Charles, or at least he used to. But now, with the possibility of a mole lurking inside his company, James had to question everything. Later that afternoon, Michael called again, and this time, his voice was tight with urgency. "I found something, James. You're not going to like it." James's heart sank. "What is it?" "It's Charles." The words hit James like a punch to the gut. "Charles? That can't be right. He's been with me since the beginning." "I know," Michael said, his voice grim. "But I found enough evidence to tie him to Victor. He's been feeding Victor information for years, siphoning off funds and manipulating deals to benefit him. Charles has been playing you from the inside. James." James couldn't believe what he was hearing. Charles, the man he had trusted more than almost anyone else, had been betraying him all along. "Are you sure?" James asked, his voice laced with disbelief. "Positive," Michael said. "I've got the documents to prove it. Charles has been in Victor's pocket for a long time." James felt a surge of rage like he had never experienced before. Charles, his trusted advisor, had been working with Victor to undermine him. Everything James had built, everything he had worked for, had been tainted by their betrayal. "I'm going to confront him," James said through gritted teeth. "He's not getting away with this." "Be careful," Michael warned. "If Victor's involved, Charles might not be working alone." James hung up the phone, his mind racing. The betrayal cut deeper than he could have imagined. But now that he knew the truth, he wasn't going to sit back and let Charles and Victor continue to manipulate his life. That evening, as James prepared to confront Charles, he felt a sense of clarity wash over him. For years, he had been searching for answers about Isabella, and now that he had them, he realized that the fight wasn't over. This was about more than just justice for her. It was about taking back control of his life. He met Emily in the hallway, her face reflecting the same determination that burned inside him. "Are you ready?" she asked quietly. James nodded. "It's time to take them down." With a sense of purpose, they stepped into the night, ready to face the truth head-on and to finally take the first step in dismantling the web of lies that had been spun around them for far too long. The confrontation with Charles was inevitable. As James sat in his study that night, waiting for the meeting he had arranged, the betrayal simmered in his mind. Charles, a man who had been with him through thick and thin, had been part of the very plot that destroyed his life. It wasn't just the anger, it was the deep sting of betrayal, cutting deeper than any business deal gone wrong. This was personal. Emily stood by the window, her silhouette framed by the dim light of the mansion. She hadn't said much since James told her about Charles, but he could sense her unease. This wasn't just about their shared quest for justice anymore. This was about survival. The walls were closing in, and they both knew it. A knock echoed through the hallway, pulling James from his thoughts. He stood, squaring his shoulders as he made his way to the door. When he opened it, Charles stood there, looking as calm as ever. The man had an air of professionalism that had always reassured James, but now it felt like a mask, one hiding years of deceit. "Come in," James said, his voice cold and flat. Charles stepped inside, glancing around the room before meeting James's gaze. "You wanted to see me, James?" James gestured to the chair across from his desk, his expression unreadable. "Have a seat." Charles sat down, his usual confidence intact, though James noticed a flicker of something in his eyes. Was it hesitation? Doubt. "I've been reviewing some things," James began, his voice measured. Some discrepancies in the business, funds going missing, deals falling through that should have succeeded. Charles's expression remained neutral, but James could see the subtle tension in his posture. "I'm sure we can clear that up," Charles said smoothly. "There's always some level of unpredictability in business. Things slip through the cracks." James nodded, leaning forward slightly. "That's what I thought too, until I dug deeper." Charles's jaw tightened ever so slightly, but his composure didn't break. "What exactly are you getting at?" James held his gaze for a long moment, letting the silence stretch out between them. Then he spoke, his voice low and dangerous. "I know you've been working with Victor." The accusation hung in the air, heavy and damning. Charles's eyes widened, just for a fraction of a second, before he regained control of his expression. "I don't know what you're talking about." "Don't lie to me," James snapped, standing up and slamming his hands on the desk. "I have the proof. You've been siphoning money, manipulating deals, and feeding Victor information for years, all while standing by my side, pretending to be loyal." Charles's calm demeanor finally cracked. He stood abruptly, his face hardening. "You don't understand, James." "Oh, I understand perfectly," James shot back, his voice filled with rage. "You sold me out. You helped the man who destroyed Isabella's life, who destroyed my life." Charles's face twisted with frustration. "You think this is about loyalty? This is about survival, James? Victor isn't someone you can just cross. He controls everything, and if you had any idea what you were up against, you'd know why I did what I had to do." James's hands clenched into fists. "So, You betrayed me. For what? Money? Power? Charles shook his head, a bitter smile on his lips. You've always been so naive, James. It's not just about money. Victor has power that you can't even imagine. And if you think you can take him down, you're a bigger fool than I thought. James stared at the man he had once trusted with his life, feeling the last shred of that trust crumble to dust. You chose the wrong side, Charles. Charles's eyes narrowed. Maybe, but I'm still alive, aren't I? Before James could respond, the sound of footsteps echoed down the hall, and Emily appeared in the doorway, her face pale. James, we have a problem. James turned to her, sensing the urgency in her voice. What is it? There are men outside, she said quickly, her voice shaking slightly. I saw them when I was checking the security cameras. I think Victor sent them. James's blood ran cold. Of course, Charles had been buying time. Victor wasn't just pulling the strings from afar, he was coming for them. Now, Charles smirked, leaning back in his chair. You see, I warned you. Victor doesn't leave loose ends. James's mind raced as he processed the situation. They were surrounded, and Charles had clearly set them up. But he wasn't going to let Victor win. Not now. Not after everything. We need to leave, James said, his voice steady despite the adrenaline coursing through him. He turned to Emily. Get to the safe room. I'll handle this. Emily hesitated, fear flickering in her eyes. What about you? I'll be fine, James assured her, though he wasn't entirely sure of that himself. Go. She nodded reluctantly and disappeared down the hallway. James turned back to Charles, who was watching the exchange with a smug expression. You really think you can get out of this, don't you? Charles taunted. I don't think, James said, his voice cold as ice. I know. Without another word, James moved swiftly, grabbing Charles by the collar and shoving him against the wall. The sudden move caught Charles off guard, and for the first time, real fear flashed in his eyes. You've betrayed me for the last time, James growled. You're going to tell me everything, how Victor operates, who's involved, and how I can take him down, or you won't make it out of this mansion. Charles swallowed hard, his bravado slipping. You don't understand, James. Even if I tell you, Victor will never let you walk away. James pressed harder, his voice a deadly whisper. Let me worry about that. Before Charles could respond, the sound of glass shattering echoed from the front of the house. James's heart raced. They didn't have much time. Tell me, James demanded, his grip tightening. Charles hesitated, glancing toward the broken window and the men surely advancing toward them. All right, he relented. Victor has been working with several of your top investors. They've been funneling money through shell companies for years, using your business as a front. He's built his entire empire on the back of yours. James's stomach twisted with disgust. He had suspected something like this, but hearing it confirmed made his blood boil. And the mole? James asked through gritted teeth. Who else is involved? Charles opened his mouth to speak, but before he could get the words out, a gunshot rang through the air, cutting through the tension like a knife. James's grip on Charles loosened as he realized the shot hadn't come from inside the mansion. It had come from outside. Charles gasped, clutching his side as blood seeped through his shirt. His eyes widened in shock and fear as he stumbled back, collapsing onto the floor. James froze, his mind racing. It was happening. Victor's men were here, and they were willing to kill anyone in their way, including Charles. But there was no time to mourn. James turned, his survival instincts kicking in. He had to get to Emily. He had to protect her, no matter the cost. As the chaos unfolded around him, James knew one thing for certain. The battle wasn't over. It had just begun. The mansion's once quiet halls were now filled with the echoes of chaos, shattered glass, heavy footsteps, and the low hum of danger drawing ever closer. James moved swiftly, the adrenaline coursing through his veins as he sprinted down the corridor toward the safe room where Emily had gone. His mind raced through every possible scenario, but there was no time for hesitation. Victor's men were here, and they wouldn't stop until they got what they came for. As he reached the door to the safe room, James could hear Emily's frantic breathing on the other side. He knocked sharply, keeping his voice low but firm. "Emily, it's me. Open the door." The door clicked open a moment later, and Emily stood there, her face pale and her eyes wide with fear. "James, what's happening? What do we do?" James pulled her inside, closing the door behind them and locking it tight. "We stay calm," he said, his voice steadier than he felt. "They're here for me, not you. I need you to stay hidden no matter what happens. Do you understand?" Emily swallowed hard, her eyes searching his for reassurance. "What about you? You can't fight them alone." James glanced around the small, reinforced room. It was designed for exactly this kind of situation, built to withstand an attack, but that didn't make the reality of it any less terrifying. He knew he couldn't stay locked in here forever. Eventually, they would have to face Victor's men, and he wasn't sure they'd survive that encounter. "I won't let anything happen to you," James promised, though he wasn't entirely sure he could keep that promise. "But right now, we need to stay quiet." The air in the room was thick with tension as James and Emily sat in silence, listening to the sounds of the mansion being torn apart. Heavy footsteps echoed through the halls as Victor's men moved closer. James clenched his fists, every fiber of his being screaming for action, but he forced himself to remain still. Rushing out now would only get them both killed. Minutes passed like hours, the oppressive silence broken only by the distant crash of furniture and the occasional muffled shout. James knew they were looking for him. Charles had already paid the price for his betrayal, and now James was the final target. Then, the footsteps stopped. James's heart pounded in his chest as the quiet stretched out, the tension growing unbearable. He glanced at Emily, who sat beside him, her hands trembling slightly as she tried to keep her composure. He reached out, placing a comforting hand on hers. "It's going to be okay," he whispered, though he wasn't sure how much he believed it himself. Suddenly, a voice cut through the silence, muffled by the thick walls of the safe room, but unmistakable. "James Thompson," the voice called out, deep and commanding. "I know you're in there." James's blood ran cold. He knew that voice. It wasn't one of Victor's hired men. It was Victor himself. Emily's eyes widened in fear, her breath catching in her throat. James squeezed her hand, signaling her to stay calm. "I have no interest in dragging this out, James," Victor's voice continued, cold and calculated. "You've fought long enough, haven't you? But this ends now." James gritted his teeth, the anger boiling inside him. Victor had taken everything from him. Isabella, his business, and now his very sense of safety. But he wasn't going to surrender. Not now. Not after everything. "Do you think you can hide forever?" Victor taunted, his voice filled with smug amusement. "You're out of moves, James, and I'm right here. You're not getting out of this mansion alive." James clenched his fists, his mind racing. Victor was close. Too close. There was no way they could sit in the safe room indefinitely. Sooner or later, Victor's men would break through, and when they did, there would be no escape. "I'm giving you one chance," Victor called out, his voice carrying through the halls. "Open the door, and we can settle this like men, or I'll tear down this place brick by brick until I find you." Emily looked at James, her fear mirrored in her wide eyes. "What are we going to do?" she whispered. James took a deep breath, his mind calculating every possible outcome. Running wasn't an option, and neither was hiding. If they stayed in the safe room, Victor would eventually find them, and the outcome would be the same. There was only one choice left. "We fight," James said quietly, his voice steady despite the fear gnawing at him. "I'm not letting him win." Emily's eyes widened. "But how?" James glanced around the room, his eyes landing on the emergency weaponry stored in the safe room. There was a small cache of firearms, enough to defend themselves but not enough to hold off an army. Still, it was their best shot. He moved quickly, opening the small compartment in the wall and retrieving 2 handguns. He handed one to Emily, who took it with trembling hands. "I've never—" she started, her voice shaking. "I know," James said gently, placing a hand on her shoulder. "You won't have to. Stay behind me. I'll take care of this." Emily nodded, her eyes full of fear but also trust. She believed in him, even in this darkest of moments, and that gave him strength. James loaded his weapon, his hands steady as he prepared for what was about to happen. The sounds of footsteps grew louder as Victor's men moved closer, their voices now unmistakable outside the door. They were coming. "Ready?" James whispered to Emily. She nodded, her grip tightening on the gun in her hands. With one last deep breath, James unlocked the door and pushed it open, stepping out into the hall with his gun raised. The corridor was dimly lit, shadows dancing on the walls as 3 of Victor's men stood at the far end, their guns drawn. The moment they saw James, chaos erupted. Gunshots rang out, the sharp cracks echoing through the mansion. James ducked behind the doorframe, firing back with precision. The air filled with smoke and the acrid smell of gunpowder as the fight unfolded. One of Victor's men went down, but the others kept advancing, their footsteps heavy and unrelenting. James moved quickly, pulling Emily behind him as they retreated further into the mansion. They couldn't stay in one place for too long. As they reached another corridor, James caught sight of a figure standing in the shadows at the end of the hall. It was Victor. The man stepped forward, his face twisted in a sinister smile. "I told you, James," Victor said, his voice cold. "You can't win." James aimed his gun, his heart pounding in his chest. But before he could fire, Victor spoke again, his words sending a chill down James's spine. "You think you've been fighting this battle alone?" Victor said, his smile widening. "You have no idea how deep this goes." James's finger tightened on the trigger, but in that moment, he hesitated. Victor's words hung in the air, heavy with implication. What did he mean? And then, in a move James didn't see coming, Victor raised his own gun and fired. The shot rang out, and everything slowed to a crawl. James felt a searing pain in his side, the force of the bullet knocking him back. He staggered, his vision blurring as he clutched his side, blood seeping through his fingers. Emily screamed, rushing to his side, but James pushed her away. "Run!" he gasped, his voice strained. "Get out of here!" But Emily didn't move. She stood frozen, her face pale with terror, and as James fell to his knees, the last thing he saw was Victor's shadow looming over him, his cold laughter echoing through the halls. James lay on the cold floor, his vision dimming as Victor's mocking laughter filled the hall. Pain radiated through his body, the bullet wound in his side searing with every breath. He struggled to stay conscious, his mind racing with only one thought, Emily. He had to protect her. He couldn't let Victor take her, too. But as darkness crept in, he felt Emily's hands on his shoulders, trying to pull him up. "James, stay with me," she cried, her voice thick with panic. He could feel her trembling, her fear mixing with the overwhelming sense of helplessness. She was scared, but she wasn't running. She refused to leave him. "Emily," James gasped, trying to force the words out. You have to go." "No," she said fiercely, tears welling in her eyes. "I'm not leaving you. Not like this." Victor's footsteps echoed closer, each step heavy with finality. James knew they didn't have much time. His vision blurred, but he could still make out Victor's figure approaching them, his gun raised, the smile on his face twisted with cruel satisfaction. "This is how it ends, James," Victor said coldly, his voice dripping with triumph. "You lost." But before Victor could pull the trigger, a deafening gunshot rang out from behind him. For a split second, everything stopped. Victor staggered, a look of pure shock crossing his face as he turned. clutching his chest where blood had begun to bloom across his shirt. Standing behind him, her hands steady and her face filled with grim determination, was Emily. Her eyes burned with a mix of anger and pain as she watched Victor fall to his knees, the life draining from his body. "You were wrong," she said quietly, her voice trembling but strong. "We didn't lose." Victor's eyes locked with hers for a moment, and then he collapsed to the ground, motionless. The room fell silent, the weight of what had just happened settling in the air. Emily stood frozen, the gun still clutched in her hands, her breath coming in short, panicked bursts. James, barely conscious, looked up at her, his chest swelling with pride despite the agony coursing through him. You did it," he whispered, his voice barely audible. Emily's eyes filled with tears as she dropped the gun and rushed to his side, her hands pressing against his wound in a desperate attempt to stop the bleeding. "I couldn't let him take you," she said, her voice breaking. "I couldn't lose you, too." James wanted to say something, to comfort her, but the pain was too much. His eyelids grew heavier and the world around him began to fade. The last thing he saw before the darkness claimed him was Emily's face, her tears falling silently as she held him close. James woke to the steady beeping of machines, the sterile scent of antiseptic filling his nostrils. He blinked, disoriented, as his eyes adjusted to the soft light of the hospital room. His entire body ached, but the pain was dulled, and for a moment he couldn't remember why he was here. Then it all came flooding back. Victor, the mansion, the gunshot. He shifted slightly, wincing as his side throbbed. Glancing around the room, he saw Emily sitting in a chair beside the bed, her head resting on her folded arms as she slept. Her face was peaceful, but he could see the dark circles under her eyes, evidence of the long nights she must have spent worrying. James's heart ached for her, for everything she had been through. She had lost her mother, been thrown into a world of danger, and had faced down a man like Victor with more bravery than he could have ever imagined. And now, she had saved him. As if sensing his gaze, Emily stirred, lifting her head slowly. When she saw that he was awake, her eyes widened in relief, and she stood up quickly, rushing to his side. "James," she breathed, her voice filled with emotion. "You're awake." He managed a weak smile, though every movement sent a fresh wave of pain through his body. "Barely," he joked, his voice raspy. Emily let out a shaky laugh, though her eyes were shining with tears. "I thought I lost you," she whispered, her voice breaking. James reached out, taking her hand in his. "You didn't," he said softly. "You saved me." For a moment, neither of them spoke, the weight of everything they had been through hanging between them. There were no words that could capture the enormity of what had happened. The loss, the betrayal, the violence. But in this moment, they didn't need words. They were alive, and that was enough. "Victor?" James asked, though he already knew the answer. "He's gone," Emily said quietly, her expression serious. "It's over." James closed his eyes, letting out a slow breath. The nightmare that had consumed their lives for so long was finally over. Victor was dead, and with him, the power he had wielded over James's life and business was gone. But the damage he had done would take time to heal. In the weeks that followed, James slowly recovered from his injuries, and together with Emily, they began the process of rebuilding their lives. The mansion was repaired, the remnants of Victor's final attack erased from the walls. But the scars remained, emotional ones that would take longer to heal. Michael helped James track down the last of Victor's associates, dismantling the corrupt business empire that had been built on the backs of James's hard work. Bit by bit, James reclaimed control of his life, but it was a slow, arduous process. Emily stayed by his side through it all. The bond that had formed between them in the midst of tragedy only grew stronger as they navigated the aftermath together. They mourned Isabella's loss in their own ways, but they found solace in each other in the shared understanding of what they had both lost. One evening, as the sun set behind the hills surrounding the mansion, casting a warm golden light over the garden, James and Emily sat together on the porch. The silence between them was peaceful now, not heavy with unspoken fears or unresolved questions, but filled with a quiet sense of understanding. "What now?" Emily asked, her voice soft as she looked out at the horizon. James glanced at her, a small smile playing on his lips. "We live," he said simply. Emily smiled, her eyes bright with hope for the first time in a long while. "Yeah," she agreed, "we live." The future was uncertain, but for the first time in years, it felt like they had a chance to build something new, something free from the shadows of the past. They would carry the memories of Isabella with them, but they would not be defined by her loss. They had each other, and that was enough. Together, they would move forward. Together, they would heal. And together, they would live